July 1945, Camp Swift, Texas. The exam room is hot and still, smelling of disinfectant and dust, while a tired ceiling fan clicks above a worn army table. A 24-year-old German woman, POW, stands in the doorway, her legs shaking so badly she can barely move them together. I can't close my legs, she whispers to the American doctor, who thinks he is about to see a battle wound or some secret injury. He asks her to take off her boots, and when he looks down, he does not see blood from a bullet, but bones, open sores, and the raw truth of months of slow starvation. In one of the richest food nations on earth, an enemy prisoner has arrived at the edge of death from hunger, and what this doctor does next will change how thousands of POWs are treated. This is a true story of war, collapse, and one small exam room that shaped modern medicine. Stay with me to the end, and if you want more real World War II stories like this, please like the video, subscribe, and support the channel so we can keep bringing you these powerful histories. July 1945, Camp Swift, Texas. The Army exam room was small and hot. Disinfectant burned in the nose. A ceiling fan clicked above, pushing warm air in slow circles. Dusty sunlight slipped through the screen and drew pale lines on the worn linoleum floor. The door opened with a soft metal squeak. A young woman in a faded German uniform stepped in, holding on to the frame as if it were a crutch. Her name was Keith Schmidt. She was 24 years old, but she moved like someone twice her age. An American nurse from the Women's Army Corps, Lieutenant Sarah Chun, stood at her side. "This way," the nurse said gently, guiding her toward the examination table about 12 feet away. It should have been a few easy steps. Captain David Morrison watched from beside the table. He was 42, a doctor from Philadelphia, a man who had seen war wounds in North Africa and Italy. He had treated men torn by shrapnel, lungs filled with infection, bodies thin from poor rations. He thought he knew what starvation looked like. "Please walk to the table," he said, through an interpreter. Keith pushed herself forward. One step, her legs shook. Second step, her hand shot out to grab the wall. She breathed hard, as if she had climbed a hill, not crossed 2 feet of floor. It took her almost a full minute to cover those 12 feet. Morrison felt something tighten in his chest. At 24, she should have been strong. Instead, each step looked like a struggle against gravity itself. To him, it was the first sign that something was very wrong. He began with the basics. The nurse called out numbers as she wrote them down. "Height, 5 feet 6 inches, she said. "Weight, 87 pounds. 87 pounds at 5 foot 6. A healthy woman, that height might weigh 130 to 140 pounds. Morrison did a quick calculation in his head. Her body mass index was around 14. Normal would be close to 20 or 21. She was not just thin, she was in danger. Her blood pressure was low, her pulse fast but weak. Her temperature was slightly raised. Up close, her cheeks were hollow. Her eyes looked too large for her face. "I need to examine your legs and feet," Morrison said. "Please remove your shoes and socks." Keith stared down at her boots. Her fingers trembled as she bent to untie the laces. The leather was cracked and rubbed shiny at the heels. The room was quiet except for the fan and the slow scrape of lace against eyelet. I cannot close my legs," she said in halting English, not looking up. "They shake. It hurts here." She touched the sides of her knees, then her ankles. When she pulled off the first boot, the smell hit them. Old sweat, damp cloth, and something sharper, sour, the wound scent of hidden infection. She peeled away the thick sock. Morrison looked down and for a moment lost his calm. Her calves were no more than sticks wrapped in skin. There was almost no muscle. The bones of her shin and ankle pushed forward like the edges of tools under thin cloth. The skin itself seemed almost see-through, pale and stretched tight. Her feet were worse. Each toe was sharply outlined. The tops of her feet were a web of blue veins. Several toenails were broken or discolored. Around her ankles and the sides of her feet were open sores, round and angry, some with a yellow edge, some raw and red. In places, the shoe had rubbed straight through skin onto bone. "Mein Gott," the nurse whispered before she caught herself. Later, Morrison would write in his report, "Lower limbs show extreme muscle wasting, multiple pressure ulcers on feet and ankles, some infected. Edema present at ankles despite overall emaciation." He had seen hunger before. He had never seen it cut this deep into a young woman's body. The strangest part was the swelling. Even at 87 pounds, her ankles were puffy, holding fluid. The contrast was shocking, stick-thin legs ending in swollen joints. It was a classic sign that her body was failing, pulling apart its own tissues while still trying to hold on to water and salt. "How long have you had trouble walking?" the interpreter asked. "Since January, maybe February, yeah," Keith answered softly. "The rations became small, then very small, then almost nothing. My legs, they stopped listening to me." In his notes, Morrison later wrote, "Patient appears 60 in gait, 24 in face. Body has been living off its own muscle for months." This wasn't propaganda. It was reality, laid bare in bone, skin, and infected sores. Outside the camp, American fields were full, and US soldiers ate 3 meals a day. Inside this room, an enemy from the losing side could barely move her legs together without pain. It was a cruel paradox. In the richest food nation on earth, the prisoner in front of them was starving to death. Morrison finished his first exam in silence. He knew at once this was not a simple case of a little underweight. It was the end point of a long road of hunger that did not start in Texas. To understand how a healthy clerk from Hamburg had come to America with legs like twigs and feet full of wounds, he would have to look back across the ocean to the last, desperate months of a collapsing Reich, and to the rations that shrank day by day until there was almost nothing left. To understand Keith's thin legs in Texas, the story has to go back to Germany months earlier, and to a country that was running out of everything. In early 1944, Keith Schmidt was an ordinary young woman in a grey office. Not on a battlefield. She worked as a clerk in a supply office near Hamburg. Her job was paper, lists of food, fuel, uniforms, train schedules, warehouse reports. Germany still called itself the land of order and planning. Trains ran on time, forms were stamped, rations were counted. At first, the war only brushed against her life. The air smelled of coal smoke and wet paper. The sound of typewriters and rubber stamps filled the room. Her ration card gave her bread, a little meat, some fat. It was not rich, but it was enough. Then the bombs came more often. Hamburg was hit again and again. At night, the sky glowed orange, sirens screamed, the ground shook under her feet, warehouses burned, rail lines twisted in the heat. Whole districts turned to black ruins. She remembered the taste of dust in her mouth and the grit that settled on her desk the next morning. As the destruction spread, the numbers on her forms began to change. Trains that had always arrived now did not. Warehouses that had always been full now reported almost nothing. Food that had been promised to civilian workers was sent to soldiers at the front instead. The rations became smaller, then very small. Keith later told an American interviewer. At first they cut sugar, then meat, then even bread. We were told it was temporary. It was not. By late 1944, a normal German civilian ration in many cities had dropped to around 1,200 calories a day, far below what a young adult needed to stay healthy. On paper, workers like Keith were supposed to get a bit more. In practice, the papers meant little when trains were bombed and depots empty. There was another cruel twist. Men at the front were the highest priority. Factory workers came next. People like Keith, who worked in offices and on telephones, were placed at the bottom. She worked in supply, yet she herself became one of the last to receive supplies. "This was the irony," she said years later. "We stamped ration papers that promised food we never saw." By January 1945, her meals shrank to a thin soup and a crust of bread. Some days there was only the soup. It was mostly warm water with a few potato skins or pieces of turnip. The taste was weak and bitter. Her stomach growled all day. Her body began to eat itself. The winter was cold. The wind from the river cut through thin walls and thin coats. Standing at her desk, she felt lightheaded. Her fingers shook on the typewriter keys. Climbing stairs left her breathless. She noticed her skirt hanging loose, her belt needing extra holes. By March, many in her office ate one real meal a day, at most. Some counted themselves lucky to reach even 800 calories. Keith and her friends tried to laugh about it, but their laughter came out thin. "We ate anything," she recalled. Dandelions, nettles, beet tops. Once there were biscuits, but they were mixed with sawdust to make them larger. We ate them anyway. In April, supply lines broke completely in some areas. Bridges were down, rail yards smashed. Her unit retreated west from one makeshift post to another, always walking, always hungry. Her boots, once tight, now slipped on her feet because she had lost so much flesh. The leather rubbed new paths into her skin. Each day of marching opened the sores deeper. "There were days with no food at all," she said. We walked and tried not to think of it. Some people just sat down and did not get up again. By the time British forces captured her group in May 1945, Keith, at 5'6", weighed around 90 pounds. Her cheeks were hollow, her legs weak, her feet torn. The British gave her basic rations, maybe 1,600 calories a day, enough to stop the free fall but not to rebuild what was gone. She was moved through temporary camps, then handed to American control. The Atlantic crossing to the United States took about 2 weeks. The sea was rough. The transport ship smelled of fuel oil, metal, and many bodies in close space. Keith was seasick for days. Food was there, but her stomach turned at the smell. Much of what she swallowed came back up. She likely lost more weight during that voyage. When the ship reached New York, she could barely stand through processing. Other women from her group, less weak than she was, helped her. The 4-day train ride to Texas was a blur of rattling wheels, coal smoke, and short, careful steps to the latrine, always holding on to someone's arm. By the time she reached Camp Swift, months of severe malnutrition had stripped away her strength. Medical officers would later estimate she had lived under true starvation conditions for at least 4 to 6 months. She was not a soldier from the front. She was an office worker, yet she arrived as a near skeleton. The great paradox was clear. A nation once famous for order and planning had broken so badly that even its supply clerks were starving. But in Texas, Keith would soon learn she was not the only one. When Captain Morrison began to examine the other women from her transport, he would discover that her story was not unusual at all. It was part of a much larger pattern. Keith's case stayed with Captain Morrison long after she left the exam room. That night, in the dim light of a desk lamp, he wrote a report more detailed than any he had filed before. The office smelled of ink, old paper, and the ever-present carbolic from the nearby ward. He listed every number. Height, 5 feet 6 inches. Weight, 87 pounds. Estimated BMI, 14. Severe underweight, marked muscle loss in lower limbs, multiple pressure sores on feet and ankles, some infected, signs of vitamin C and D deficiency, hair thin, nails brittle, gums inflamed, condition life-threatening, without treatment. At the end, he added a line that was not just about one woman. Recommend full examination of all female prisoners in this transport. Suspect prolonged severe malnutrition may be common. The next morning, he took the report to Major Thomas Henderson, the camp's chief medical officer. Henderson read it slowly, lips pressing tighter with each line. "This is worse than we expected," Henderson said, looking up. "We knew Germany was short of food, but this is systematic starvation." "Or a complete collapse of supply," Morrison replied. "Either way, if she is typical, we have a problem that our normal intake routine won't catch." Henderson nodded. "Examine the rest. All 30 women. Document everything. We need facts, not guesses." For the next 3 days, the exam room became a quiet factory of bad news. One by one, the women from Keith's transport stepped inside. The air was always the same. The sting of disinfectant, the faint smell of old wool uniforms, sometimes the sour odor of unwashed skin and old wounds. Morrison and Lieutenant Chun moved through the same steps each time. Height, weight, blood pressure, a look at hair, teeth, skin, then legs and feet. The numbers piled up like grim statistics on a chart. Out of the 30 women, 23 showed clear signs of serious malnutrition. 15 had body mass indexes below 16, which meant they were not simply thin but dangerously underweight. 8 had bleeding gums, loose teeth, or bruises that did not match any injury, classic signs of scurvy from lack of vitamin C. 6 had swelling in their legs or ankles, even though their bodies were almost skeletal. One woman from Berlin whispered, "I used to weigh 65 kilos, now I am 42. I stopped looking in mirrors." Another, a telegraph operator, said, "We were told to be proud, to endure, but you cannot endure when there is nothing to eat." Their stories matched Keith's. Rations cut again and again, trains that never came, one thin soup a day by March, some days nothing by April. Office workers and radio operators far from the front had become the lowest priority in a dying system. Morrison's notes became a pattern rather than a list of separate cases. He wrote, "Findings consistent across majority of group. Evidence of 4 to 6 months of inadequate calories and multiple vitamin deficiencies. Condition not due to individual neglect, but to wider breakdown." He took photographs too with the women's permission. Legs like sticks, shoulders like coat hangers, swollen ankles above worn boots. The click of the camera shutter sounded harsh in the quiet room. Years later, those black and white images would appear in medical lectures about starvation. When he had finished all 30 exams, he assembled a second report, thicker than the first. It contained tables of heights and weights, summaries of symptoms, and a clear conclusion. These prisoners were not simply enemies to process. Many were medical emergencies. Major Henderson called a meeting of the camp's medical staff. The room was crowded with doctors, nurses, and corpsmen. The windows were open, letting in the warm Texas air and the distant sound of trucks on the road. Henderson held up the report. "This is not an isolated case," he said. "Out of one transport of 30 women, more than 2/3 are seriously malnourished. Nearly half are in the severely underweight range. This isn't propaganda. It is reality, and it is now our responsibility." He laid out new rules, clear and firm. All incoming prisoners of war will receive a full medical exam that looks closely at nutrition. Anyone with a BMI under 17 will get extra rations and medical oversight. Anyone with signs of vitamin shortage will receive supplements. Vitamin C, D, B complex, iron. Infected wounds will be treated before assignment to regular barracks. We will also create a special ward for those who need long-term nutritional care. Captain Morrison will organize it. One doctor asked, "Are we equipped for this level of care for enemy prisoners?" "We will have to be," Henderson said. "The Geneva Convention demands adequate treatment. More than that, it is simply the right thing to do." The contrast was sharp. German officers had filed papers while their own clerks starved. Now American officers were writing new rules to protect those same former enemies. They had come to the camp expecting to guard prisoners. They were now, in part, protecting patients. As the meeting ended, plans began for a converted barracks. 20 beds, extra nurses, new supplies of protein foods and vitamins. The next step would be harder than counting calories on a form. It would mean rebuilding broken bodies one careful meal at a time, walking a narrow line between too little and too much. What happened inside that new ward would test not only medical knowledge but also patience, as the staff learned how dangerous it could be to feed a starving person too quickly, and how slowly hope could return, ounce by ounce. The new medical ward was a long wooden barracks at the edge of Camp Swift. The army had stripped out the old bunks and lined the walls with metal hospital beds, white sheets, thin pillows, a small table by each bed. The air smelled of soap, boiled linens, weak broth, and the sharp bite of disinfectant. 8 of the 30 women, including Keith, were moved there first. They were the worst cases, the ones who could not walk far or stand for long. When they lay flat, their bones pressed through the mattress. When they sat up, they tired quickly. Captain Morrison walked the row each morning with a clipboard. Nurses took pulses, temperatures, and blood pressures. They wrote down every number, heartbeats per minute, degrees on the thermometer, pounds on the scale. These figures would guide everything. Feeding them was like walking on a knife's edge. Too little food, and they would not recover. Too much, too fast, and their damaged bodies could fail. Morrison had read about refeeding syndrome, a dangerous shock that could happen when a starved person suddenly received normal meals. Electrolytes, the salts in the blood, could swing wildly. In bad cases, the heart could stop. So the plan was strict and careful. Week 1, Morrison told the staff, no more than 200 calories a day. 6 small meals, easy foods, broths, porridges, soft eggs if they can take them. We watch closely. The first trays came rattling in. Thin oatmeal, a spoon of mashed potato, a small slice of soft bread, weak tea. To a healthy soldier, it would look like almost nothing. To these women, it was the most food they had seen in months. At first, Keith ate slowly, more because she was told to than because she felt hungry. Her stomach cramped. She felt sick after only a few bites. "There is so much," she whispered to the nurse, looking at the half-full bowl. "My body has forgotten how to eat." But the nurses urged them on, one small spoon at a time. If someone felt sick, the next portion was delayed, not cancelled. The aim was steady intake, not big meals. Morrison ordered daily weights. The numbers barely moved in the first week. Some women gained a pound, some nothing at all. One lost a little water, as the worst of their swelling eased. "Do not be discouraged," he told them. "Your body is learning again. This takes time." In week 2, calories rose to around 1,500 a day. The food grew slightly richer, more potatoes, a bit of meat, thicker soups. Vitamin tablets were added. vitamin C for their gums and skin, vitamin D and calcium for their bones, B complex for nerves, iron for their thin blood. The tablets were chalky and bitter on the tongue, but they were vital. By the end of that second week, Keith had gained about 3 pounds. It did not show much to the eye, but she felt small changes. The constant chill eased a little. The sores on her feet, now cleaned and dressed each day, started to close at the edges. The swelling at her ankles began to fade as her body's fluids came back into balance. "There is less fog in my head," she told Morrison during one exam. "I can think without so much effort. It is strange. I almost feel guilty." "Guilty for what?" he asked. "For eating so well when my mother is still in Hamburg," she said. "She has less than this, I'm sure." The paradox was painful. In a land of plenty, the enemy prisoner was gaining strength, carefully counted calorie by calorie, while her family, in ruined Germany, faced empty plates. Week 3 and 4 brought further increases up toward 1,800 calories. More protein appeared, beans, small portions of meat, sometimes powdered milk, stirred into drinks. The sound of spoons on bowls grew louder. Some women began to ask for seconds. That was a good sign. Physical therapy started in small steps. At first, it meant only sitting up longer, then standing next to the bed with someone holding an elbow. The first walks were just across the ward and back. The floor felt hard under still tender feet, but the pain was less than before. By week 4, Keith's total gain reached about 8 pounds. Her face softened slightly. Her hair no longer came out in clumps on the pillow. She could walk the length of the building without stopping, though she still held on to the bed rails. Morrison took new photos. The same legs as before, but a little fuller, the sores smaller, the skin less tight over bone. He wrote, "Patient gaining approximately 2 pounds per week. Muscle returning slowly. Wounds healing. No signs of refeeding syndrome. Emotional state improved." By week 8, Keith was up around 15 pounds from her lowest weight. She could climb a short flight of stairs if someone stayed close. By week 12, she had gained about 22 pounds in total, bringing her to roughly 109 pounds, still thin, but out of the most dangerous zone. "I thought I would die," she admitted one day, sitting in a shaft of warm sunlight by the window. "Now I can imagine a future again. I did not expect that." Across the ward, others were making similar progress. The records showed a clear pattern. With careful feeding and vitamins, starved bodies could come back. This wasn't propaganda, whilst it was reality, written in rising weights and healing skin. As strength slowly returned, so did words. Morrison and Keith began to talk more during their weekly checks. She spoke of Hamburg, of propaganda, of what she had been told about Americans. Those conversations and the letters that followed would soon show another strange truth. Sometimes an enemy camp could be safer than home. By late autumn 1945, the air at Camp Swift had cooled. Mornings were crisp, and the ward's open windows let in the smell of dry grass and distant wood smoke instead of only dust and heat. Inside, the women in the nutrition ward were different too. There was still tiredness, but there was also quiet laughter, the clink of spoons, the creak of beds as people sat up on their own. Keith could now walk across the compound without help. She weighed about 109 pounds, more than 20 pounds above her lowest point. Her legs still looked thin, but she could climb stairs slowly, carry her own tray, even help fold linens at a table by the window. Her mind, once dulled by hunger, felt sharp again. With strength came questions. One day, during an exam, she asked Morrison, "How is it that I eat better as a prisoner than I did as a free person in Germany?" He paused before answering. "Because here, supplies still move," he said simply. In 1944, the United States produced more than enough food for its own people and for its armies overseas. Our ration system limits choice but not calories. We have no true famine here. But at home, she said, we were told you were starving too, that American cities were in ruins, that your people were thin. Morrison shook his head. No, our cities were not bombed like Hamburg or Berlin. Most Americans went through the war with full plates. This is the part propaganda does not show. This wasn't propaganda. It was reality, Keith would later tell her daughter. I saw with my own eyes that the hungry enemy we were promised did not exist. As winter approached, the Red Cross told camp authorities that some prisoners would now be allowed to send letters home. 6 months had passed since Germany's surrender. Mail routes were broken, but slowly reopening. There was a limit. 1 or 2 short letters carefully censored, nothing about military secrets. For Keith, the hardest part was the first line. How did she tell her mother somewhere in ruined Hamburg that she was safe, gaining weight, and sleeping in a clean bed in Texas? She began simply, "Dear Mama, I am alive. I am in a camp in America. It is called Camp Swift in Texas. I am writing to tell you that I am well and that you must not worry." The paper smelled faintly of ink and dust. Her hand shook a little as she wrote about the final months of the war, the thinning rations, the endless walking, the sores on her feet, the day she could barely stand. She wrote, "My legs stopped working. I could not close them without shaking. When the American doctor saw my feet, he was shocked. He said I was near death from hunger." Then came the strangest line of all. "The Americans have fed me and treated me. I have gained weight. I can walk again. They have been correct and humane, not cruel as we were told. I receive more food here than you probably do in Hamburg. I am grateful, but I feel guilty also." When the letter left Texas in December 1945, it traveled slowly through Red Cross hands across the Atlantic into a Germany where post offices were broken, streets blocked, and many buildings roofless. It took nearly 3 months to reach Hamburg. In April 1946, Keith received a reply. The envelope was thin and worn. The paper inside smelled of damp and coal smoke. Her mother's handwriting was shakier than before. "Dearest child," it read, "I thank God that you are alive and healing. Do not feel shame for being fed. It is a comfort to me to know that somewhere you have enough to eat. Hamburg is in ruins. We live in 2 rooms with relatives. Our ration is small, but we survive. Come home when you are allowed. We will rebuild together." The contrast was sharp. In Texas, Keith was on 3 careful meals a day, plus extra bread and milk as her weight returned to a healthy range of around 120 pounds. In Hamburg, a typical official ration could be far below 1,500 calories, and often much less in practice. Yet it was the mother in ruins telling the daughter in safety not to feel guilty. While these letters moved slowly across oceans, Morrison's case files moved much faster through the U.S. Army's own system. His reports on the 30 women at Camp Swift, with their tables of weights, symptoms, and recovery, were copied and sent to the War Department's Medical Command in Washington. In October 1945, a senior medical officer, Colonel James Bradford, arrived at Camp Swift to see for himself. He spent 3 days reading the files, looking at the photos, talking with the patients. He walked through the ward, the smell of soap and stew in the air, past beds where women from the losing side now rested under American blankets. "This is remarkable work," he told Morrison. "You saw that this was not an isolated case. You changed intake rules and built a program. You have more set of stamps for soldiers. I think often of the irony. We once believed we would rule Europe. Now we line up for cocoa powder from you." They had come as conquerors. They left as students, forced to learn from the people they had called enemies. In 1950, she wrote again, "Hamburg is slowly rising from the ashes. I have married a man who was also a prisoner. He was in France. He says he, too, was fed better in captivity than at home. We talk often of this paradox." By 1955, another letter said, "We have a daughter now. She is healthy and well fed. When she asks about the war, I tell her about Texas, about the American doctor who treated me as a human being. I want her to know that enemies can show kindness and that this is not propaganda, as it is reality I lived." Morrison also moved on. He was discharged from the army in June 1946 and returned to Philadelphia. But he did not forget the ward in Camp Swift. He opened a medical practice with a special focus on nutrition and recovery. On his office shelves were thick folders from Texas, over 30 full case histories, more than 100 pages of charts, photos, and notes. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, he published several scientific papers using that data. One study detailed how carefully increasing calories from 1,200 to 1,800 a day, plus vitamins, could safely bring people back from severe malnutrition. Another warned about refeeding syndrome and set guidelines for avoiding it. These papers were soon cited again and again. Medical schools used them to teach young doctors how to treat famine survivors. In a 1978 interview for a medical journal, a reporter asked him, "What was your most important case in the war? A battle wound? A major operation?" Morrison shook his head. "It was a young woman who could barely walk 12 feet because she had been starving for months," he said. "Her case taught me that medicine is not about flags or uniforms. It is about seeing suffering and answering it." By 1995, a historian of nutrition who studied war and famine wrote, "The Camp Swift records created by Captain Morrison are among the most detailed documents of starvation and recovery we possess. His week-by-week measurements and careful photos formed a template for modern treatment of severe malnutrition in crisis zones." The old exam room at Camp Swift was long gone by then. The camp itself had been dismantled. New grass grew where barracks once stood. But in archives and libraries, the paper trail remained. Case files, tables of weights, the photo of a young woman's wasted legs next to another taken 12 weeks later, showing the slow return of flesh. Keith died in Hamburg in 2001 at the age of 80, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had never known true hunger. Her daughter later donated her letters, including the ones to Morrison, to a city archive. Morrison died earlier in 1988, aged 85. His family gave his wartime papers to a medical history collection. Researchers still open those boxes. They still see the numbers, 30 full case histories with months of follow-up. "This will shape how we treat prisoners everywhere," Morrison answered quietly. "I was just doing my job, sir." "No," Bradford replied. "You were documenting what happens when a modern state collapses and stops feeding its own people. These records will be studied for years, by doctors, by historians, maybe even by those who plan for future crises." In that moment, the exam room in Texas became more than a place where one doctor and one patient met. It became a window into bigger truths, about war, about hunger, and about how an enemy's body can tell a story no speech ever could. Soon the war would be over for Keith. Repatriation lists were being drawn up. Hamburg waited, damaged, but still there. And long after she went home, the papers that carried her numbers, 87 pounds, then 109, then 118, would continue to travel, shaping ideas about medicine, responsibility, and humanity. Those ideas and the memories they carried would not end with the war. They would follow both. Keith and Morrison into the peace and into history. In the spring of 1946, Keith's name finally appeared on a repatriation list. The war was over. Ships and trains now carried prisoners back across the Atlantic, instead of soldiers going the other way. On a warm Texas morning, the air smelling of dust and engine oil, she walked to the medical office for one last exam. Morrison looked at the numbers on her chart. Height, still 5'6". Weight now about 118 pounds. Her BMI, once around 14, was up near the low end of normal. Her legs, once like sticks, now had shape. The scars on her feet were pale and closed. "When you arrived," he told her, "I was not sure you would live. Now you are healthier than many civilians in Europe." "You saved my life," Keith said quietly. "You, the nurses, the food, the medicine. I will not forget. I only did what any doctor should do," he replied. "You were a patient who needed help." They shook hands. The room smelled of alcohol swabs and clean linen, just as it had the first day. But everything else had changed. She left the ward not as a skeleton barely able to stand, but as a young woman who could walk with her head up. Back in Hamburg, the shock was different. When Keith stepped off the train, she saw a city of broken walls and empty windows. The air carried dust, smoke, and the faint smell of burned brick that never quite went away. Streets were blocked by rubble. Many buildings were only shells. Rations were still small, often under 1,500 calories on paper, and sometimes less in reality. Yet she had one advantage now, a body rebuilt, some English and clerical skills. She found work with the British occupation authorities, helping to sort forms for rebuilding and rationing. The work felt strange, but important. In a letter to Morrison in 1947, she wrote, "I now help organize food cards in 7 and 118, the notes about sores and vitamins, the quiet proof that care can cross battle lines." Their bodies were gone, the war long over, but the lesson from that hot Texas room lived on. When a doctor chose to see a patient instead of a prisoner, he changed not only one life, but also how the world understood hunger, recovery, and responsibility. The story of Keith Schmidt and David Morrison begins with one shocking sight. Legs so thin they could barely hold a body upright in a land of overflowing storehouses. It grows into something larger, a record of how a modern nation let its own people starve and how its enemy measured, fed, and healed them. The contrast is sharp. One side preached strength but lost control of bread and trains. The other side dropped bombs yet kept its prisoners alive with careful care and calories. They had come as conquerors. They left as students, learning that power without responsibility leads to ruins and empty plates. In the end, America's greatest weapon was not its bombs, but its abundance, and the choice to share it, even with those who once wore the enemy's uniform.